Okay, good morning, everyone. Hope everybody had a good summer. I've spent my summer deep inside my books, trying to prepare for this series. Probably a little over-ambitious. I'm going to try to get half the presidents this session, and the other half in the spring. I make no promises as to whether I'm going to be successful in that. The one thing that I do promise that I'm going to hold to as much as I can, I'm going to get every president. And I'm going to go in chronological order. So we'll see how that goes. So George Washington, I want to say first off that I want to make the claim that George Washington is the greatest benefactor that this country has ever had. Now, I did not say that George Washington is the greatest man or greatest person that this country has ever had. That's something that's a lot more difficult to define, means different things to different people. Something that I will argue, though, that George Washington is the greatest benefactor. And I think I'm on more solid ground when I say that, and this is what I'm going to try to present this morning. So we start off with our bibliography. Paul Johnson is a historian that I thoroughly enjoy, always gives a different slant to whatever topic he writes about, and he writes about many different topics. Biographies, history of the Jews, history of the English people, history of the United States, and always interesting, always provocative. His initial first famous book was Modern Times back in the 1980s, and it was something that gives a slant on modern times, the 20th century, that you just won't see otherwise. But Paul Johnson, very short book, 126 pages, is not going to give a full account of George Washington in any sense, but he gives highlights and anecdotes and gives a very good commentary on the life of George Washington. So I thoroughly recommend that one. The next one, Forrest McDonald, The Presidency of George Washington, is just on his presidency, not his whole life. Has some very interesting things to say about George Washington, but interestingly, spends a lot of time talking about other things going on in the country at the time, and does not give a thorough account of George Washington in that time. For whatever reason, but still something that I could recommend. Richard Brookhiser, Founding Father, 230 pages. I would say if you want a short account of George Washington's life, this is about as short as you can get and still cover the major aspects of his life. In the details, he necessarily leaves out a lot of things or goes through them very quickly, but in his comments on Washington, I thoroughly enjoy. He has some really nice things to say. It's okay. He has some very interesting comments about George Washington that are well worth reading. Joseph J. Ellis, His Excellency George Washington, 320 pages, a more thorough account of Washington's life, and he gives his commentary as he goes. And again, very well done. I highly recommend it. And still fairly short, if you didn't want to get into anything too far. And then we come to Ron Chernow. I'm sure that some of you are familiar with him. He wrote the biography of Hamilton, which inspired Lin-Manuel Miranda, right, who wrote the play Hamilton. So, an excellent writer. 904 pages, however. If you are okay with that length of book, it's a great read. Ron Chernow, pretty much anything he writes is fairly entertaining reading, enjoyable, thoroughly researched, and I can certainly recommend it. He's written several biographies that are well respected and renowned. So, yeah, great read. James Thomas Flexner, Washington, the Indispensable Man. Back in the 70s and 80s, if you were to want to read a biography of George Washington, this was the go-to book for that. Very popular, a fairly thorough account, 430 pages, nicely done, and this is the one, they did a TV miniseries on this in the 80s, I believe, taken from this. And of course, throughout the 1960s, he was doing research on Washington and completed his 4-volume set. This is the next one. George Washington, 4 volumes, came out in 1969. If you are a real die-hard fan of Washington and you want to know pretty much every detail of his life, not every detail, but very thorough, you can get into this. And it is still readable. Many books about Washington that are thoroughly researched by great scholars are a little difficult to read, a little on the dry side. And when you're talking about 4 volumes, it's a lot to get into. But this is still very readable. Unlike the next one, Douglas Southall Freeman, 7 volumes. And I joke about that. He is somewhat dry, but not terribly so. I've read much worse. But it's 7 volumes, and he goes into great length on many aspects of Washington's life. So, yeah, if you're really ambitious as an amateur historian, this is not easy to come by the way. I bought the 7 volumes at a library sale, and I was lucky to find them. You do not see them very often because it's not exactly on the top 10 list of popular books. So, but it's regarded as the great scholarly achievement in Washington studies, and as you read through it, almost every page has footnotes at the bottom. Some of the pages are half filled with the notes that he has written, and can be valuable too. I was comparing Flexner with Freeman on the content aside from the notes, and I estimate that the narrative part of Freeman's work is about the same length as the 4 volumes of Flexner's, because so many pages have notes in them. So, just a comment. Washington in the movies. This is the TV miniseries that came out in the 80s. Anybody see this? Don't remember it at all, huh? I watched it, and for those of you who know me, you know what I'm going to say. I didn't like it. The reason I didn't like it, however, is different from what I normally will say. Is usually when somebody makes a movie about a historical figure or event, they change a lot of things. And that irritates me to no end, because I really want history to be accurate. In this case, it looks like they were trying to be accurate, but in the events that happened. They really made an attempt to put in all the accurate details. What they didn't do is try to get George Washington right. He did not come off, and of course this is my imagination, right? What was George Washington really like? How did he talk to people? How did he walk? How did he ride a horse? How did he talk to his men? How did he talk to his wife? Interacting with people. In my imagination, this guy, he was nothing like George Washington. For one thing, he smiled too much. George Washington would never smile like that. Not that he never smiled, and he did have a sense of humor, but he was not light-hearted like this guy was. So anyway, that's my 2 bits for that. Now, for those of you who want to become world-renowned George Washington scholars, this is where you start. 39 volumes of George Washington's papers. You can buy them online. I looked it up. You can buy them online for maybe $1,100, and you can start there. 39 volumes of George Washington papers. However, that is only the beginning. In the Library of Congress, if you are thoroughly obsessed with George Washington, this is what you would do. You take a look at the Library of Congress, you go there, you have the exercise books, diaries and surveys, 40 plus volumes. The letter books, 41 volumes. The letter books from the Revolutionary War, 44 volumes. The family letters and papers, and this goes back to the late 1600s, by the way, in the Washington family, 297 volumes. The financial papers, 34 volumes. The military papers, 26 volumes. Applications for office, and these are people who wrote to Washington wanting various positions that he could give them. That's 32 volumes. And then there's the miscellaneous volumes of other things that don't fit into these categories. Can you imagine wanting to be the Washington scholar who read everything? Quite impossible in my imagination. But there it is in the Library of Congress. Okay, now I'm going to go very quickly through his early life so I can get to the presidency. By the way, how many of you were at my other lecture when I did George Washington through the Revolutionary War period? A few of you. So if you want to get the Revolutionary War period, you can look up my lecture. I'm on YouTube and you can see that one. I'm going to skip through that or briefly cover that as I go here. So, February 22nd, 1732, Augustine and Mary Ball Washington of Virginia was his parents. His father died when he was 11. His older half-brother, Lawrence, was his father figure growing up. He had a basic but thorough education, was talented in mathematics, and became a surveyor in his teenage years. He was meticulous, conscientious, very hard-working man. And we're moving on. At age 40, this is 1772, before the Revolutionary War period, but we're getting into it. He was already a soldier. He was well known as a soldier through the French and Indian War. And then, of course, his military career. His expedition as a young man up the Ohio River. He was renowned as the guy who helped the disastrous retreat that I'm not even going to go through. Chosen as commander-in-chief of the Colonial Army, the War of Independence. He was not a great tactical commander. The British outmaneuvered him a number of times and made him look foolish for his lack of preparation. But he always kept his army together. That was the great genius and great leadership that he had. One thing that probably no one else could have done, and I'll talk about this more later, was hold the army together. Even though he lost one battle after another, he held his army together and won in the end through dogged determination and patience. So here is Washington the general. This was a painting done at the end of the Revolutionary War. You'll notice that his hips are a little large and his shoulders are a little narrow, which is kind of an odd thing for a man of his stature. You'd think that he would have the big broad shoulders and the more narrow hips, but he did not. What he did have was enormous hands that everybody would comment on. And fortunately for most people, he did not like shaking hands. He would rather bow. Not that he never shook hands. And more than one person found out to his chagrin that if you're going to get a good handshake from George Washington, it's going to hurt. Because he had very strong arms and hands, and if he did shake your hand, it was an experience you would not forget. So, through the Revolutionary War period, we won the war. Now we're moving on, establishing our country. Washington, his first truly great act was that he resigned his commission to Congress. He was encouraged to, by a few and many other people who would not say so openly, would wish that he would march on Congress and take it over and establish himself as the leader of the country in one form or another. Not necessarily a king, but a dictator. Congress was famously inept, disorganized. The soldiers were starving, and they had been through the whole war. Treated very poorly, never supplied well, walking barefoot often, through many winters with very little clothing, and the soldiers were fed up. More than once, they gathered together and were going to march on Congress to demand their back pay, to demand supplies so that they could eat, so that they could be clothed. And Washington, each time, a couple of times in particular, stood in front of them and said, "Men, you cannot do this. This will not stand." And he had them back down. At the end of the war, he received one letter in particular from a man that did not know him, but the man was encouraging him to take control, to take power. Anyone can see that the Congress is inept, and nobody could really tell that any good was going to come from it. And Washington wrote a very famous letter back to this man, saying how horrified he was. Why would you think I would do such a thing? You couldn't have written this letter to anyone that would be more disgusted by that suggestion. I will keep this to myself. I won't tell anybody that you have written this to me unless you make it public. But don't ever make any kind of a suggestion like that again. So we went on. He encouraged everyone, the American people, to be loyal to this very inept Congress. And once it was finally seen that the government was not organized well, we needed a new constitution. So 1787, we established or worked on through that summer a new constitution. Who's going to preside over this convention? Well, there's only one man who could, George Washington. Nobody could imagine George Washington being there and somebody else presiding. No one could preside over George Washington, and everybody knew that. So he presided over it. He didn't give a lot of input. That was not his role. But he was the presiding man over this convention. And of course, the convention focused on the decisions that were made, the Constitution that was written, especially when they described the duties of the president, had George Washington in mind. The reason that the president has the powers that it has was because of George Washington. Everybody knew he was going to be the first president. There was no question about that. He was chosen unanimously. But then, once he's president, who's going to be in the cabinet? Cabinet is not what they said at the time, called these secretaries. Of course, that's a later development. But George Washington had, by good fortune, some of the greatest minds available in the world, in history. Alexander Hamilton, Secretary of the Treasury; Thomas Jefferson, Secretary of State; Henry Knox, Secretary of War; Edmund Randolph, Attorney General, and that was his cabinet, as we would call it now. But he also had James Madison as one of his closest advisors. And James Madison, of course, later became president. I'll talk about him another time. But he was considered the father of the Constitution. That was the great mind of James Madison. James Madison was in the House of Representatives, but he was also, at the time, George Washington's closest advisor, and helped him write speeches, his inaugural address, and so on. John Adams, vice president. Sadly, John Adams gave very little input during his tenure as vice president. Not really sure why. He was also one of the great minds in the United States at the time, but Washington never seemed to confide in him or ask him advice. And then John Jay, Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, the first Chief Justice. It's interesting that the Supreme Court was not really, was in some sense an afterthought. We think of the great three branches of the government. The Supreme Court was kind of put together after the Constitution and after George Washington got going in his presidency. But we had John Jay, also a reasonably good advisor to George Washington. So here is Washington's cabinet. Edmund Randolph you don't often hear about as one of the great minds, and he, compared to the others, he wasn't. However, on a number of occasions, when there was kind of a deadlock between Hamilton and Jefferson, who were the two great advisors for Washington, it was not unusual for Edmund Randolph to have the compromise that fit nicely between the two sides. So, day-to-day operations. How did Washington work with his advisors, his secretaries? And Thomas Jefferson actually gave a very good account of what the day-to-day operations kind of looked like. Washington supervised his secretaries very closely, frequently asking them for advice, for papers to draw up on various issues, and constantly asking questions, and always wanting their letters. When they received questions or requests from various parts of the country, they would compile it, they would write their own comments, and they would give them to Washington. And this was almost a daily basis. Washington wanted to know. And of course, Washington received a lot of letters himself, and he would often send the letters to the appropriate department to be dealt with, whether Hamilton or Jefferson or Knox, and ask for their input. And daily, usually, they would compile these letters. They would give their input, write their comments if necessary, and give them to Washington. Washington spent many hours every day looking over this correspondence, and if necessary, he would write his own comments in all of these and send them back to the secretaries. And then the secretaries would now know what the president wanted, what direction we're going in any given policy. And with that, it was a very efficiently run office.
A question.
Yes.
Why did everybody consider him so great? Was it his mind or his oratory or both?
It was not his oratory. He was not a great speaker. What he had was the presence. And it's one of those indefinable things that when he walked into the room, you knew it. When he spoke to you, it was with an impact that common people don't have. He just had that aura of leadership that you knew he was in charge. And that's about as best as I can do. He had very good judgment in his in the decisions that he had to make. He had the commanding presence. Of course, he was 6'2" or 6'3", depending on who you're reading, which meant he was much taller than most people of the day. The average height is more like 5'6" or 5'7", so he towered above most people. But yeah, it's the commanding presence, the self-assured man who knew what he wanted, knew what needed to be done, and was able to get things done because people respected him so well. There was also a social life, a social aspect to the presidency, and there are many things that George Washington set the precedent for because he's the first president, and he knew he had to behave in a particular manner as president. So he had levees, which was somewhat taken from the royal courts of Europe. The king would have a levee in which people would come and see him and have their social time. So he had his levees every Tuesday from 3 to 4, and this was open to any well-dressed man. Any well-dressed man who wanted to see Washington could come on Tuesday, and they would have this levee. And Washington would stand in the room, the people would gather, and they would socialize. Martha Washington would have tea parties for men and women on Friday evenings. And this was actually what Washington enjoyed more than the levees. Washington, for all of his great leadership skills, for all of his self-confidence, he was often rather uncomfortable in some social situations, like these levees, where he was expected to socialize with other men, some of whom he did not know. And so it was as if he was trying to put on a show of some sort that he was never very comfortable with. He was a man of action. He wanted to do things. He wanted to get things done. Standing around socializing with people he didn't know, men, he didn't care for. And he was often fairly uncomfortable with that. However, he loved the company of women. And they loved him too. So Martha's tea parties, he enjoyed tremendously. All the women just oogled over him. They loved him, the tall, handsome man, and he loved putting on a show for them too. So that was far more enjoyable for him. And then there was the official dinners every Thursday at 4. So here's a painting that shows his social gatherings. And there's Washington over here with the ladies. And just as a side note too, whenever there was a ball, Washington loved to dance. And he was a very good dancer, very graceful. And of course, the women loved dancing with him. I don't know how often he danced with Martha. Martha was very short. George Washington, 6'3", Martha under 5 foot. So that seems a little bit awkward to dance with, but I don't know. I'm not sure she was much of a dancer herself, but she was okay with George Washington out on the dance floor with the ladies. So, not long after he became president, he had a very harrowing experience. Had a tumor on his thigh, and it was a very fast-growing tumor. He actually knew a man who had worked for him on his plantations who had died with a very similar tumor on his thigh. So it was a very concerning thing when George Washington developed this tumor. And so what do you do in the 1700s when you have a tumor on your thigh, fast growing, and you know it will take your life if you do not do something about it? Well, you have it removed surgically with no anesthesia. And so during this operation, as the surgeon was cutting deeply into his thigh, George Washington was gritting his false teeth and hanging on. And the surgeon, being very nervous, because here he is with the life of the president, George Washington no less, in his hands. And the assistant surgeon was watching this and telling him, you need to cut deeper. Look at George Washington, how well he takes this. And he took it pretty well. And he had this surgically removed. But it was a long haul to get back to normal again. He had to lay on his side for 6 weeks, basically, throughout every day. Although he did still travel around New York City. And by the way, the capital was in New York at this time. This is where he lived before Washington, D.C., which he never lived in. So he still wanted to travel in his coach, and so he was carried to his coach, and he traveled the city so that people could see that he was still in charge. He was still the man. He was still president, still alert. And then, even more seriously, 1790, he caught pneumonia. And the doctors who were attending to him did some horrific things to him. medicine back in those days being what it was, what do you do when someone is very ill? Well, you bleed them, right? Everybody knows that the best thing for you is to lose some blood when you are ill. The other thing that you do is blister them. You get glass, heated glass, and put on your back or your front or wherever, and you blister the skin. And that's a surefire method of curing many diseases, as they all believed back in those days. But for some reason that wasn't working. And so his pneumonia got worse and worse. And watching Washington laying in his bed, having that rattle breathing that some people call the death rattle, listening to that, they thought for sure, the doctors thought for sure he was not going to make it. And there were a few days where that was the case. George Washington laid out. He was going to die. And then, by some miracle, he recovered. He got better. It took some time in recovery, but George Washington recovered his health. And the phrase that they would use through both of these illnesses, Washington came through this with uncommon fortitude. Very strong man, never despairing, even though he knew possibly that he could die. He was brave through both of these crises.
Did the vice president take over? Did Adams take over?
Well, so the interesting thing about the presidency back in those days, you could go on vacation for literally weeks and no one would miss you. There was so much fewer things needed to be done. When Congress was out of session, it was very common for the president to go back home for weeks at a time. Now, he would still answer correspondence because people were still writing letters and still asking questions and still wanted this or that. But yeah, basically, Congress isn't in session, go home, have a vacation. When I talk about John Adams, he took that to an extreme. For months, he would be at home and just answering correspondence. But yeah, I don't know of any particular thing that John Adams did at that time because it probably just wasn't necessary. Didn't have the black box with the button to nuke the rest of the world. So, one thing that Washington wanted to do, and this goes against what some people think of as Washington being the distant sort of man who was not comfortable being close with other people, that he was not a very sociable person. But Washington wanted to know the American people. And he was, as first president, he traveled the country. He went on 2 grand tours in the north and one in the south. And he met people, ordinary people, throughout the country, meeting from town to town. And of course, he's celebrated everywhere he goes too, which is kind of a nice thing when you travel. But he would go from town to town and in his coach and meet ordinary people and meet the mayor, meet the councilman, and get to know what the ordinary people are thinking. No other president did that for quite some time. Washington did, because he wanted to know what was going on in the country. And he always kept a certain distance. He was always dignified, but very affable, friendly, and talkative. He wanted to know, as I say, what was going on. So here's George Washington traveling the country. And then we get into the nitty-gritty of governance. Alexander Hamilton, one of the great minds in our nation's history. And I'll say again that, that Lynn Miranda did our country a great service by writing that play about Hamilton, because he can be a kind of a forgotten character, but it was Hamilton who set our country's finances straight. So, Hamilton in finance, 3 great reports that he wrote. Report on public credit details how the United States needed to pay off its debts, the foreign debts, the debts that were the federal government debts, and then the state debts. 3 different categories that needed to be paid off. And how do you do that? Report on a national bank. This is how you regulate your currency, according to Hamilton. Modeled on the British banking system with American details involved to adjust to our particular situation. And then report on manufacturing, as opposed to Jefferson, who thought of our country as an agrarian society, believing that the farmer was God's chosen instrument to be the base of our economy. Hamilton thought of manufacturing. That's the future. And we should encourage it in Congress by any way we could. So those are the 3 great reports that he made that are today still thought of as milestones in our history. But it rubbed a lot of people the wrong way. First of all, the debts. How do you pay off the debts? There are different types of debts, as I mentioned. Now, the debts to ordinary people during the Revolutionary War, the Congress gave out certificates to pay off many different people, the soldiers in particular, and they weren't worth very much. But if you still had them, Congress now, according to Hamilton, wants to pay these off at full value. Unfortunately, for a lot of soldiers and a lot of ordinary people, they already got rid of their certificates at a deep discount. So for sometimes as much as 15 cents on the dollar. And so they really missed out. So some people said, look, we need to discriminate between those who have already given up at a discount their certificates and those who have them now. Very quickly that was seen as unworkable. It's very unfortunate that ordinary soldiers, ordinary farmers are going to have to take this loss, but we cannot go back and find everybody who ever had one of these certificates or several of them and pay them the full value. It'd be impossible. So that was very quickly decided you just can't do it. It's just unfortunate. But it did create a lot of animosity for those who lost out on that. The other issue is assumption. The individual states had their debts that they needed to pay off. Some states thought this is our responsibility and we will pay off these debts. Other states decided, well, this is something that the federal government should ultimately do. And this went on for several years until we had our new constitution and our new government. And so some states paid off most of their debts, some states did not. Oddly enough, it was the southern states who, more often than not, had been paying off their debts. The northern states, like Massachusetts, was not paying off its debts. But now here's Alexander Hamilton saying, the federal government is going to assume all of these debts equally. And so there was a great uproar. It didn't make any sense. We've paid off our debts almost completely, and that other state has not. And yet now it's going to be assumed by the federal government. So there is a firestorm of protest over that. Such an angry reaction by so many people. Some were thinking, this is it. The states are not going to hold together. This is something that they're just going to fall apart. The states are not going to stand for this. So the compromise that was made was, look, southern states, we don't have our capital, permanent capital. We're in, the capital right now is New York. That's where Washington is in the Congress. How about if we give to the southern states our national capital? We'll send it, we'll create it out of Virginia. We'll call it Washington, D.C., the District of Columbia. And that will be a big boost to the southern states. And they grumbled about it. They didn't like it, but that was enough to push them over the edge and say, okay, we'll go with this. And then the next one, the bank. Southern states don't like banks. They don't like the centralizing power of one entity that controls the currency. The northern states, manufacturing states, did. So this was another thing. Alexander Hamilton, he became a very hated figure in the South and a very loved figure in the North because of this, the bank. So Madison and Jefferson were arguing with Washington, saying, aside from the fact that we don't like this centralizing power of the bank, we don't think it's constitutional. We have a strict interpretation of the Constitution. Nowhere in the Constitution does it say that the government can establish a bank. Therefore, it cannot. Hamilton said no. We have a loose interpretation of the Constitution. It doesn't say anywhere in the Constitution that the United States can't form a bank. And it does talk about the welfare of the people that the government is supposed to be pushing. Therefore, it should be perfectly constitutional to establish a bank. And this was something that Washington struggled with for some time. But Hamilton eventually explained it to him that this is perfectly constitutional. And again, I have to say, for Hamilton, the genius of Alexander Hamilton, there were other men in the country who could talk about finances in a fairly detailed manner. None of them could compare to Alexander Hamilton. His ability to organize the thoughts, the details of finance were far and away beyond what anybody else could muster. And so he convinced Washington that yes, this is constitutional and I can make it work. And he did. And this is how the various parties really got going too. Because of this issue, we have now the Federalists, who Washington sides with, Hamilton and others, and you have the Republicans, sometimes called Democratic Republicans, earlier were called Anti-Federalists, and that's Madison and Jefferson. Yes?
I was wondering, how did Hamilton say he convinced the president that the Constitution allows for the Constitution to regulate currency? How could he have, interesting to know, have been in on these discussions, because in
Yes, and I'm sure that's what the angle that he was taking. It does not mention a bank, though. So,
Exactly.
right. So, basically, it was Jefferson and Madison and the Republicans in general didn't like the idea of a centralizing bank. And so they came up with this angle of it must be unconstitutional because the Constitution doesn't mention it. As I get into the presidencies of Jefferson and Madison, you'll find that as presidents, they changed their view because expediency makes one change their views very quickly when it comes to the difference between a strict constructionist view of the Constitution that limits the power of the president and Congress, and then when you are president and you want to get things done, you start thinking, well, maybe we can loosen up the constitutional views a bit. So anyway, during Washington's first term, Hamilton had his newspaper. He had his man supporting him, and he would write articles himself and put it in the newspaper. John Finno and the Gazette of the United States, that was the pro-federalist paper. And Jefferson, seeing this, thought, well, doggone it, I need to have a paper too. And so James Madison knew this guy, Philip Freneau. Does that name sound familiar to anybody? Philip Freneau. If you are into poetry, Philip Freneau is a fantastic poet. He's often called the poet of the Revolution because of his poetry during the Revolutionary War and other things too. Side note. James Madison knew this guy, Philip Freneau, and so they set him up. They gave him a government job, and they said, look, we want you to run this paper and give the opposing view. And so he did. And Philip Freneau not only gave the Republican view, and initially it was fairly benign, just giving the opposite viewpoint. As time went on, Freneau really got into the dark side of publishing newspapers, and the articles that he wrote became rather scathing. So that's basically George Washington's first term. There's a lot of other things that I'm not going to cover, just I don't have the time. But now we're going to get into the various crises of the second term. George Washington wanted to step down. The cares of office and the criticisms that he was now taking on, he didn't like too much. And so he had James Madison write him up a farewell address. And James Madison did. But everybody knew we still need George Washington. Whether you were a Federalist, whether you were a Republican, you know you need George Washington because nobody else could inspire the nation as a whole to stay together. The animosities that were growing between the North and the South and other various interests were very tempting for some states to say, you know what, I've had enough of this. I really don't like the other side. Maybe we should go our own way. The only person that everybody could agree on was still George Washington. And so people were begging him, please, you have to run again. You have to be president. You have to have another term. And so he said, okay. He did not make that decision until right before the election. Literally days, not even weeks, before the election, Washington said, fine, I'll run again. And so he was elected again unanimously. Now we get into, for me, kind of a fun character. Yes? No, there wasn't anybody who would run against him. Of course, it was very different, and I don't want to get off on this too much, but it was how the president was elected was very different from what we have today. We had some amendments to the Constitution that had to fix a few things because there was no distinguishing between president and vice president. The person who got the most votes was president. The guy who came in second was vice president. And that's how it worked in the Constitution. But the backroom dealings, everybody would kind of figure out and would say, okay, everybody knows George Washington is going to be president, and then we're going to have our secondary guy, John Adams. So anyway, Citizen Genet, as we all know, the French Revolution is in high gear at this point. We're now in Washington's second term, and what to do about France? France has now declared war on all monarchies and is going to spread the Enlightenment to everyone. Kind of like a century later, the communist revolutions in various parts of the world. It was almost a religious experience for so many people that they wanted to spread this enlightenment to everyone. So France is now at war with England, and we have a new ambassador from the revolutionary France. The Girondists are the latest group that have taken control in France, and they send this character, and what a character he was. Brilliant, charming, he spoke 7 languages with ease, and very intelligent, young-ish, 30 years old, and he comes very confident, very brash, comes to the United States, lands in Charleston, and decides he's going to spread the good news of French Revolution to everyone. And in America, people loved him. They thronged. Isn't this wonderful? Our friend who helped us in our revolution is now had their own revolution, getting rid of the monarchy. They're going to be an enlightened republic like us, and we want to help them out. And so when he landed and he started talking to people and saying that Britain, who still has a monarchy, is the enemy, and we're going to defeat them together, aren't we? And so he starts encouraging. He's brought with him letters of marque, which means he's going to give people the ability to become privateers and attack British shipping. And this is before he's even talked to Washington. Okay, so he travels up the coast. Throngs of people meet him and cheer him. They love him. Isn't this wonderful? And yes, down with the British monarchy. Many people are saying, yes, I will join this cause. This is great. And we're going to attack the British. Once he finally gets to, and now, by the way, the capital is now in Philadelphia. That was part of the arrangement. Temporarily, the capital will be in Philadelphia before it eventually becomes Washington, D.C. So he travels up the coast to throngs of enthusiastic supporters, and he finally gets to the capital, to Philadelphia, expecting a very warm welcome from Washington, and especially Jefferson. Jefferson was really wanting this to be a great thing too. He loved the French Revolution, and he loved wanting to spread it. So he arrives in Philadelphia, and he meets with Washington. Washington gives him a cool but polite reception. Genet doesn't get the hint. Still enthusiastic, still trying to get people whipped up with excitement about the French Revolution and attacking Great Britain. So he meets with Jefferson. Jefferson really wanted Genet to be the man. He wanted to support him, but he could see that he was going way beyond what he should. There was a great debate between Hamilton and Jefferson. What do we do about Citizen Genet, as he calls himself? Well, we can't reject him. We can't go against the country of France and their ambassador. So we're just going to stay cool about it. But we cannot encourage him either. So they issued a neutrality proclamation. Without saying neutral, by the way. This was one of the compromises between Hamilton and Jefferson. Hamilton wanted to denounce him as a radical that we cannot support. Jefferson wanted to support him, but knew that we can't declare war on Great Britain either. So the compromise statement was that the people of the United States will remain impartial, try to be friendly with both sides. They didn't want to say neutral because that's more of a technical term. So anyway, Genet goes to meet with Jefferson, knowing that Jefferson is more on the friendly side and wanting to discuss what can be done. And then Washington walks into his office. He turns and looks at Washington. Washington has a stone-cold look on his face, looking at Genet. And for those who don't know George Washington personally, anytime he gives you that look, you feel it down to your bones. And it is a very harsh feeling. Anyone would tell you that. And so Genet looks at Washington, and then he looks back at Jefferson. And Jefferson now knows he needs to give him the same look. So Jefferson is now cold towards Genet. And so he realizes that he needs to leave, and he did. And so now Genet is against Washington and against the government of the United States, or at least the presidency, I should say, and saying, now I can see that Washington is cold towards me and the revolution, so I need to go to Congress. I'm going to go over the head of Washington. The people love me. I can see that. So I can go over Washington's head. And when he published this in the papers, that he's going to appeal to the people because Washington was so cold towards him, he realized that Washington was still greater than him. And people started turning towards him, turning against him. Here, I'm getting ahead of myself here. So many people had been enthusiastic towards him. They didn't like the neutrality proclamation, and people were starting to turn against Washington. At least the mobs on the street, anyway, became very threatening, right up to Washington's own house. The newspapers, the ones who were the Republican ones, turned against Washington and were openly bad-mouthing him. And the worst of them, and this is Freneau, there was a cartoon depicting Washington being beheaded in the newspaper, and that's how bad it got. But people realized this was more of a fringe attitude. The country as a whole still supported Washington. And Washington did not, and this is significant, Washington did not try to legally stop them. He was not going to persecute those who persecuted him. He believed in a free press. This is something that's very different in world history, not just in the United States. that the leader of a country could be so reviled and would not retaliate legally and have these people arrested, thrown in jail. This is a new thing in world history. I need to emphasize that. Washington did not take it well. And something that Jefferson noted on him, that Washington was very hurt by this, very angry, and would swear, by God this, by God that, and would throw his temper tantrums in his office. But he kept it to himself and would not go public with any condemnation. And ultimately, as Washington believed would happen, Genet self-destructed. He openly defied the president. The nation was not going to support this. And Washington, in consultation with Hamilton, Jefferson, and Knox, decides now we can ask for his recall to France. And they did. Without trying to condemn France, they just wanted Genet recalled. France, in the meantime, had undergone another revolution. Now the Girondists were out of power, and we have the Jacobins, who are even more radical than the Girondists. And they send a message. They have a new ambassador, and they have the message, Genet is now under arrest. We want you to send him back for trial. Genet applied to Washington for asylum, and Washington granted it. Genet became a very prosperous citizen in New York and actually married the mayor of New York, or the governor of New York's daughter, and lived very nicely for the rest of his 30-some-odd years. And that's the genius of the United States and George Washington. Moving on, the Whiskey Rebellion, 1794, the first and only time that the President of the United States went to war, or led armies in battle. There was no battle, actually, but he did lead the army against these backwoods whiskey distilleries who were refusing to pay their taxes, burned down the tax collector's home, and set up their own rebellion in backwoods Pennsylvania. Washington got together some militia, led them out into the field, and really halfway there he realized that it was falling apart, so he came back. Alexander Hamilton, the Secretary of the Treasury, led the rest of the way and captured the ringleaders. Battle of Fallen Timbers destroyed the Native American tribes in the Northwest who were allied with Great Britain. And then, through his second term, he started losing the great talent that he had working for him. Jefferson resigned Secretary of State in 1793. Knox resigned December of 94, and Hamilton resigned January of 1795. To replace that kind of talent was not easy, and actually quite impossible. And so the remainder of his second term was a little more difficult because he just did not have the talent that he once had in his cabinet. The next firestorm in his second administration, the Jay Treaty. We needed better relations with Great Britain because we were going to go to war with them. Great Britain, out on the high seas, were seizing our ships because they're at war with France. They didn't want any shipping to trade. They didn't want us trading with France, so they would seize our ships. They would take men off of ships that they believed were British sailors, and they still had not evacuated their posts in the northwest of our country. They still had forts out there. So, this needed to be resolved. Washington sent John Jay, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, to Great Britain to settle this. He came back with a dismal treaty that did not treat the United States very well. Heavily in favor of Great Britain, gives Great Britain most favored nation status in trade, but did not give us most favored nation status trading with them. That and a number of things. One thing that they did do is they promised that they would evacuate the forts in the Northwest, but not much else was given. The Senate, that needs to confirm this, barely did. Fortunately, the text of this treaty was not released to the public, so the Senate could deliberate on this and vote on it. Just barely passed with 2/3 majority before it came out. And once it came out, another firestorm. People were enraged. I'd rather go to war with Great Britain than to submit to this awful treaty. Many people were thinking Washington knew better. However, he was still struggling with it himself and spent several weeks deciding whether he should sign it or not, because it was truly humiliating. But he did. And even though Alexander Hamilton was not in his cabinet anymore, he looked to Alexander Hamilton for advice. And Hamilton, being the overachiever that he is, wrote a 53-page defense of this awful treaty and convinced Washington that yes, we should sign this. And Washington is now savaged in the press, but more than Washington was John Jay. All up and down the coast, virtually every town was burning John Jay in effigy. But now we're at Washington's farewell. Washington was looking forward to this for some time. So he actually used James Madison's farewell address that he had written in 1792, but he also had Hamilton write it to update some other things. And interestingly, Washington's farewell address used to be read in Congress every February 22nd, up until the 1970s in our country, when we lost sight of George Washington's greatness and how great this farewell address actually is. It's kind of misnamed because it was not a speech. It was a paper that was given to the press and was published. He never spoke this. It wasn't an address at all. In the book that I have that contains the farewell address, it's 10 pages. It's not a short address, but it is interesting. It was written for the ages. It was not written for that particular time. And there's basically different themes. The main theme is national unity. He did not like the fact that we are now in two separate camps. He spoke at length as what we can do to work together. The East and the West, the North and the South, we all have our interests, but are intertwined in so many ways. We really need to stay together. We are Americans. We should not think of ourselves as Virginians or people from Massachusetts or any individual state or region. We are Americans. That was the main theme of the first part of this address. And then he talks about foreign relations. There's a misconception, or a misquote, I should say, that is often attributed to this. Entangling alliances is not in this address. That's actually something that Jefferson had in his first inaugural. it's permanent alliances that Washington was against. And he spoke of international relations as interests. We're not friends. There's this quote at the bottom, no greater error than to expect real favors from nation to nation. They are not our friends. They have interests. We have interests. That is what needs to be focused on when we have treaties with other nations. And then finally, he defends the Constitution as something that has just claim for your confidence and support. The Constitution is not perfect, but it is the best that we can have at this point. And we have the amendment process that can fix things. So these are the three main themes in his farewell address. If you ever have a chance to read it, it's much better than most of what Washington ever writes. And I say that because anytime you read at length something that Washington has written, it is difficult, it is tedious, it is wordy, it is not fun reading. Fortunately, this was Madison and Hamilton who put this together, so it's much more easy to read, although still very intellectual. Now, summing up George Washington, you will often hear apologists for George Washington, such as myself, to say things like he was a man of his times. After all, he was a slave owner, right? It's hard to condemn, or you shouldn't condemn people for not being modern when they existed so long ago. But from my point of view, I say that's not good enough. That won't do. He was a man ahead of his times in so many ways. The fact that he promoted constitutional government made him a man of his times. He promoted it, he defended it. That is what he considered the right way to have a government. That is a man ahead of his times. He refused time and time again to legally prosecute people who savaged him in the press. That is a man ahead of his time. Despite the fact that he was hurt deeply, he was angered, as I mentioned, but he would not seek any way of putting them down legally. He endured the hysteria of the people on more than one occasion, when people were mobs in the street up to his very house. He still could wait. I say patiently, but that's probably not true. But he did wait. And he knew that the enthusiasm of the crowd does not last forever. It has its height and then it dissipates. And he waited for the right time to make his public statements once the hysteria has passed. That is a man ahead of his time. He warmly accepted all Christian faiths. He did not have the religious bigotry that was so common back in those days. He even, I once read a letter that he wrote to a Jewish synagogue, not even Christian, a very warm letter of support for this Jewish synagogue. He willingly gave up power twice when he could have kept it, and with the support of those around him. When he gave up power, released his commission as general of the army to a very feeble and disorganized Congress. That was a landmark. King George III in England, when he heard about this, he said, if he does this, he'll be the greatest man in the world. And he did, willingly give up power when he could have taken it to himself. He gave up the presidency when he could have very easily become president for the rest of his life. He gave it up. Napoleon, in his last days, said, they wanted me to be another George Washington. Napoleon was not George Washington. In his will, he freed his slaves, something that, again, is a man ahead of his time. He knew that slavery was untenable, it was unjust, and wanted to do what he could to rid the nation of it. It was never anything that he could really do at that point as president, and some people consider that a failure of his, and in a sense it is. But there really wasn't anything he could have done at that point. But he did free his slaves in his will, and he made sure. I actually have a book, and I don't have it here, that is about his will. And he states in his will unequivocally that my slaves, they will be freed and they will be taken care of. You will make sure that they have the skills to support themselves in an occupation. The elderly that cannot work will be taken care of, and there will be no excuse for this not to happen. He mentions this emphatically because he knows from sorry experience that sometimes overseers are very lax in their duties and do not do what they're supposed to. But he emphasizes there will be no excuse for this not to be taken care of to the letter. In our day, George Washington is sometimes reviled for one reason or another. He was a slave owner, therefore he was evil. There's also the story that is quite true that you'll see sometimes referring to George Washington. His false teeth were taken from his slaves, some of them. We know this to be true because of Washington's ledgers, that he bought some teeth from one of his slaves. What you will not hear very often is that this was a fairly common practice for poor people to sell their teeth to a dentist to make dentures. George Washington bought those teeth from his slaves, and it was not taken against their will, is the point. Now, someone might say, well, look, they're slaves, so they have to do what they're told, right? Well, yes. George Washington, however, was not the type who would do something like that. And I know that to be true because there's an incident in which George Washington, he's in Philadelphia. He wants his cook, who is a slave, to join him and be his cook in Philadelphia. This man said, well, I want this other man with me. I believe it was his son, although now I forget. But I want this as my assistant. George Washington said, nah, I really don't want that other guy coming because he's not a very good worker. This cook, who was George Washington's slave, insisted to George Washington, no, I want him with me. And George Washington relented, said, okay, he can come. George Washington was not a tyrannical man in any sense of that word. So when he paid for those teeth, the slaves who gave up their teeth, whoever that was, did so willingly for the money, just as poor people commonly did in those days. Finally, Washington the Colossus, only Washington could organize and hold together the disparate ragtag army filled with regional animosities and prejudices, to get soldiers from Massachusetts to be in the same army as those from Virginia or South Carolina was not an easy task. Very often they would refuse to work together. You could not have them in the same regiment. But George Washington was the one man that everybody could look to and respect as their leader. No one else but George Washington could have Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson, two of the greatest leaders and strong-minded men in our history, to serve under him. Just to have one of those men as to work for another was a great achievement, because they were both, as I said, the greatest strong-minded men in our history. But together, Hamilton and Jefferson comprised one of the greatest teams, despite the fact that they were always, or almost always, at odds with each other. They often, occasionally, Jefferson might look down on Washington because he wasn't nearly as educated as Jefferson, and Washington was not. But Washington was the colossus that both Hamilton and Jefferson had to look to with respect. No one else could have done that. And no one else could have held the country together as George Washington did, as the one man that everyone could look to and respect and admire, the great man of this country. And just for fun, here's some various portraits. He sat quite often for his portraits. And this is just a few of the several paintings that were done of Washington. Of course, we're all familiar with this one, but we have another, kind of more majestic looking. This one, don't really like that one. This one, he looks like a very old man, probably taken or painted much later in his presidency. This one looks almost cartoonish to me. This one looks very stiff. And finally that one. So yeah, just a sampling of the many, and he usually did not like sitting for these things, but as favors for others, he would do it. And his life mask, taken in 1785, in his early 50s at this point. I've gone way over, as I normally do, but I felt like I had to. Yes?
Bravo, great way to start the fall term.
All right, next week, I'm going to try to do Adams and Jefferson together. We'll see how that goes.
Wish we had that guy now.
Yeah.